Hello, salutations, Niaja. Okay, so we're ready for the second part to our discussion of key facts of the civil rights movement. So we talked about some of the leaders. We talked about Rosa Parks. We talked about Martin Luther King. We talked about the strategy of civil disobedience and or legal noncompliance. And now we're looking at and we talked about some of the organizations that really were responsible for maintaining the momentum of the civil rights movement. And momentum means speed, okay? How things progressed, okay? So you had a number of different people, a whole lot of bodies who were interested in really working together in order to establish a solvent movement to make sure that blacks had access or were treated equally under the law, right? And so some laws had to be changed in order to accommodate that fact. So now, what does all of this mean? Blah, 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 blah. I know you're like, Mommy, you always talking. I know. Okay? But I want to kind of make sure you're clear what we've discussed, right? So what we already know or what we've already reviewed, what we're going to learn. So today we're going to look a little bit, we're going to kind of bring this particular section of our discussion to a close by just kind of looking at what were some of the outcomes of the civil rights movement. And then we're going to do a quick reference check just to kind of figure out what you learned, okay? What you learned overall. All right, a fact check to kind of see what you learned, okay? So now, I'm going to get started, and I'm reading from the same book. It's called Civil Rights Leaders, Inspiring African American Civil Rights Leaders. So all of our discussion on civil disobedience and on the civil rights movement all came out of the introduction of this book. I didn't even really get into the text. This is just the introduction. So even when we looked at who were some of the pioneers in the civil rights movement in terms of establishing legal recourse for blacks to actually advocate for themselves in order to get equality, getting equal treatment and equitable treatment under the law. Who was that? Why was that important? And what was its overall relevance? Okay. All right. So let's take a look. So where I ended off last time, I said I was talking about the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. Okay. So now it's time for us to get started. Okay. All right. Let's see. Meanwhile, Dr. King continued to lead civil rights demonstrations, including the March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in March 1965. The work of King and others helped to lead to the passage of such legislation as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Please excuse me for a moment. Now, that's where I left off the last time. I read that paragraph, so I'm rereading it again, and now I'm going to start with what we're reading for today. Okay? Unfortunately, the civil rights movement and its accomplishments provoked the fury of racist Southern whites. Many nonviolent civil rights activists became victims of violence. Among those murdered was Medgar Evers, field secretary of the NAACP. So people were upset that African Americans were fighting for their rights. It wasn't all white people, it wasn't everybody upset. It was a select group of people who felt like the way things were fine. And it didn't matter that people were being mistreated or their feelings were being hurt or they didn't have equal rights or equal access to resources. They were unconcerned, bless you. They were unconcerned about that. So what they wanted to do is to try to end the civil rights movement. So they tried to strategically take out the leadership of the civil rights movement. But let's see what happens. While progress was certainly being made, many blacks in the nation's urban ghettos were becoming impatient with the pace of reform. Anger was building against racial injustices that were still commonplace. Eventually, black rage exploded into numerous riots in many American cities in the North as well as the South during the summers of 1964, 1965, and 1967. So some really terrible things were happening, and we talked about Ida B. Wells working to end lynching in the South. But even if it wasn't lynching, sometimes it was also about, just mistreating people because of the color of their skin, maybe bothering a group of young black men that were standing on the corner and arresting them unnecessarily, or creating laws to say that blacks couldn't vote if they couldn't read. All of those things were really unfair. And so Because those things was happening consistently, some people were like, okay, if you all are organizing and you're trying to make a change, why don't I see a change yet? And because people were getting frustrated with the rate of change, they started to get a little agitated. And when they got agitated with the government's pace, they started trying to take matters in their own hands, and things got a little chaotic for a little while. And you know that chaotic means it got a little wild, okay? Some black leaders, including Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, disagreed with Martin Luther King Jr.'s policy of nonviolence. They came to believe that self-defense was more important than nonviolent protest. According to Malcolm X, when the law fails to protect Negroes from whites' attacks, then those Negroes should use arms, if necessary, to defend themselves. So now, Martin Luther King was advocating nonviolence, change by way of nonviolence. Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, who was the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they were both advocating self-defense. That doesn't mean to be aggressive and to go out and hurt other people. It's saying that if people are mistreating you, then you should mistreat them. And not necessarily mistreat them, but you should defend yourself. Okay, so it's not about, oh, somebody hurt me, so I'm gonna do this. But it's kind of like, well, if somebody's hitting me, I have a right to defend myself, either to stop you from hitting me or to hit you back to make sure that you don't hit me again. So, which you have a divine right to defend yourself. That's not wrong. But what happens sometimes is people can misinterpret what that means and use that as the premise to say that it's okay to just hurt other people because someone hurt your family in the past or someone hurt someone you know in the past. That's called retaliation. That's not self-defense. That's retaliation, and that's a different thing altogether. Carmichael called for Black Power. Black Panther members of the left-wing political organization formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale became involved in shootouts with police in Oakland, California. Violence in America ultimately claimed the lives of Malcolm X, who was assassinated on February 21st, 1965 in Harlem, New York in the Audubon Ballroom, and Martin Luther King Jr., who was shot and killed by a white supremacist in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. Now, at that time, when Martin Luther King, at both times, at the Audubon Ballroom when Malcolm X was assassinated and when Martin Luther King was assassinated, they were there saying, hey, we want to change, and we want to see the change come in a way that is peaceful, that everyone can enjoy, and have the freedom that stands on the creed that we've already discussed, okay? Which was what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. Okay? That's the ultimate thing. Everyone's created equal. Everyone has the opportunity to go after the things and the values that they find important. Okay? So let's see. King's assassination led to more rioting, but eventually the nation calmed down. The civil rights movement had made undeniable progress despite the years of turmoil. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first black woman elected to Congress, and by 1970, hundreds of African Americans had been elected to public office. In 1984 and again in 1988, Jesse Jackson, the civil rights activist who had been at Martin Luther King Jr.'s side when King was assassinated, was a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. Yet, at the time, most Americans, black as well as whites, would never have imagined that on November 4th, 2008, an African American, Barack Hussein Obama, would be elected president of the United States. Speaking to a cheering crowd 4 days before his inauguration, Obama took note of the enormous challenges he and the nation faced and promised to act with fierce urgency, a phrase often used by Martin Luther King Jr. Obama said that what's required is a new declaration of independence, free from ideology and small thinking, prejudice, and bigotry. And in his inaugural address on January 20th, 2009, President Barack Obama said, "The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness." Now, what's really important to note is that so there's a word, ideology, and I've used it as well. So when we talk about ideology, it's how ideas are formed. So he's saying it's time to be free thinking because most of our forms, so he was saying most of the thoughts that we form, most of the ideas we have been saturated with the systemic oppression and some of the systemic flaws and erroneous philosophies upon which our social order, not necessarily the political order, because if you look at the laws for what they are, they're basically indicating that all people deserve to be treated fairly. Okay, and with the exception of a couple that specifically noted that was specifically racially driven, many of them, it wasn't necessarily how the laws were written, it was how they were interpreted and how they were used that created the challenges. So when President Barack Obama was elected president, that was not just about Barack Obama. That was about Martin Luther King. That was about Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, Shirley Chisholm, Jesse Jackson, A. Philip Randolph, everyone who had worked, W.E.B. Du Bois, everyone who had worked hard to say, we deserve an opportunity to be equally represented in government. Now, does that mean we were equally represented in government? No, not yet. Because actually, right now, what we need is equitable representation. We need over-representation because for so long we were underrepresented and disenfranchised. And so I say all that to say that right now we're in a space and time where you, Niaja, you, my beautiful young and black gifted scholar, has the opportunity, you yet have the opportunity to change the world. And that's why I take it so seriously. Your education, your moral compass, and your social acumen. How you interact with other people, interpersonal dynamics is incredibly important because it says, hey, I am somebody. You are somebody. I love you and I want to be loved too. Okay, I respect you, so you respect me. Okay, so that's important. Um, Another very important thing I want you to think about. Oh, this is an important fact because I'm reading a book about Michelle Obama, and guess what she says? She actually went to school with Jesse Jackson's daughter, okay? And she actually helped work, and Jesse Jackson formed an organization called Push, and so she spent a lot of summers and weekends and afternoons after school working with Jesse Jackson, who was an earlier African American presidential Democratic nominee for president. And then she ended up marrying the first male black African American president of the United States. Who would have known? That's really, really amazing. So now I want you to go get a sheet of paper, a pen and a piece of paper, and we're going to work through some comprehension questions to see how much you remember, okay? So you can pause the video if you'd like. I'm just going to wait a brief moment and then we'll get started again, okay? Have you gotten your pen and paper? You have. Are you ready? Do you have your paper headed? What's your heading? That's right. You want to make sure you write your name, date, and subject. Okay? So you know your name, you know the date, and subject is this is actually reading, social studies, and writing. Well, reading and social studies. All right? So now, let's take a look. What was the opposing ideology? So these are just questions, and I just want you to answer them in a complete sentence, okay? So what was the opposing ideology to Martin Luther King's policy of nonviolence? So what are you going to do? Take the key words. I'm going to repeat the question again. Excuse me. What was the opposing ideology to Martin Luther King's policy of nonviolence? Self-defense, okay? So the answer is self-defense, but I want you to write the answer in a complete question, okay? In a complete answer or statement, okay? So what you're going to say is self-defense was the opposing ideology to Martin Luther King's policy of nonviolence, okay? So let's say that one more time. Self-defense was the opposing ideology to Martin Luther King's policy of nonviolence, all right? Next question, number 2. Name the 2 leaders credited with establishing the left-wing political organization known as the Black Panther Party. Name the 2 leaders credited with establishing the left-wing political organization known as the Black Panther Party? So let's take our keywords. The two leaders credited with establishing the left-wing political organization known as the Black Panther Party were Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Okay? Were Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. So again, you take the keywords out of your question and use that as the beginning or the stem of your answer or your response. Okay? The two leaders credited with establishing the left-wing political organization known as the Black Panther Party were Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Okay? Third question. Name the African American woman elected to Congress in 1968. Let me hear you make a complete sentence. Let's take the keywords. You want me to repeat the question? Of course. Name the African American woman elected to Congress in 1968. Are you ready? All right, we're going to take those keywords and write our response. The African American woman elected to Congress in 1968 was Shirley Chisholm. Okay? The African American woman elected to Congress in 1968 was Shirley Chisholm. Okay, last but not least, let's look at our fourth question. What was the date on which President Barack Obama delivered his inaugural address as president? What was the date on which President Barack Obama delivered his inaugural address as president? Do you have any idea? You can rewind the video if you'd like. Guess. I can tell you this. It was 1 week before my birthday. And my birthday is on January 27th. So a week before that would be what? That's right. January 20th. January 20th. So President Barack Obama delivered his inaugural address as president on January 20th of 2009. January 20th of 2009. So those were all, so that was some pretty deep information. We've been learning and exploring the civil rights movement, why it's important, how we can work together to really ensure that everybody is treated equally, because we're still fighting for our rights and we're still fighting to make sure that everyone has equal access and equal opportunity under the law. Okay, and that's a battle that we will continue to work together to fight in the legacy of Rosa Parks, in the legacy of Ida B. Wells, in the legacy of Martin Luther King, in the legacy of A. Philip Randolph, in the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, in the legacy of Medgar Evers, in the legacy of Huey Newton, in the legacy of Bobby Seale, in the legacy of Malcolm X, in the legacy of every person, SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, every person, every single person that was willing to sacrifice, James Meredith, every person that was willing to sacrifice and fight hard to ensure Shirley Chisholm, to ensure Jesse Jackson, to ensure that we as inhabitants and citizens of this great country continue to have access to all of the founding values, all of the core values that our founding fathers inscripted in the Constitution. When they wrote those words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Okay, so that's it for the civil rights movement. This video is a bit shorter because the last video was much longer. I love and appreciate you. I certainly hope that it was informative. Feel free to write down any questions. Let me know. I know that your dad should be doing this with you. So if you have any questions, you can ask him as well, because you know your dad is brilliant. All right. Have a blessed day, and I love you. I love you. I love you. I appreciate you, and I hope to speak to you soon.